Thank you very much, everyone. I'd like to invite Mr. Bert Van Zelm to address us, and then I'll speak to you after. This is the final wrap-up mission of the current International Monetary Fund program, the EFF, that Barbados has been involved in since the 1st of October 2018. I had a lot less gray hair at the time, but I'm happy nevertheless to be standing here with you, Bert. And please.
Thank you, Prime Minister. So I have a short statement. The IMF team and the Barbadian authorities reached a staff-level agreement on the completion of the 7th and final review under the EFF arrangement. The agreement is subject to approval by the IMF Executive Board, which is expected to consider the review in June next month. And upon completion of the review, about $23 million will be made available to Barbados. Economic activity in Barbados is starting to recover from the COVID-19 shock. Tourism came to a virtual standstill in April 2020, and the economy contracted by 14% in 2020. A gradual economic recovery started in 2021 and gained momentum in recent months, with tourism now just over 50% of pre-pandemic levels. Risk to the outlook remain elevated, with global food and fuel prices starting to push up inflation in Barbados. In this very challenging environment, Barbados continues to make good progress in implementing its ambitious and comprehensive economic reform program. All quantitative targets for end December 2021 and end March 2022 under the program were met, and international reserves, which reached a low of around $220 million in May of 2018, are now at a comfortable level of $1.5 billion. Government also took initiatives to facilitate renewable energy projects, adopted regulations for a procedural fiscal rule, while the Customs Department took steps to improve trade facilitation and risk management. Progress in restoring macroeconomic stability prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic facilitated a counter-cyclical fiscal policy response in the last two fiscal years, fiscal year 2021 and fiscal year 2021-22. Barbados recorded a primary deficit of 1% of GDP last year, fiscal year 2021-22, unchanged from the year before that. The expenditure envelope included funds for COVID-related expenditures, as well as housing reconstruction for the most vulnerable in the aftermath of Hurricane Elsa. And for the fiscal year that's now ongoing, fiscal year 2022-23, the authorities are targeting a primary surplus of 1% of GDP, with revenue projections premised on a continued recovery in tourism. And the authorities remain firmly committed to reducing public debt over time. And the team would like to thank, as always, the authorities and the technical team for their openness and for very candid discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of the persons who have, over the course of the last 3.5 years, played a critical role in bringing our country back to some level of stability, especially at the macroeconomic level. I think that you just heard, and you were just reminded, that when we, on the 1st of June, made the announcement to suspend our debt, we did it against much furor and much criticism, domestically in particular. And I sit here today conscious that had we not done that debt restructuring and completed it in November 2019, God knows what would have happened to us. Technically, it was completed in December with the legal work. God knows what would have happened to us once COVID hit in early 2020. And the reality is that by being able to run the first surplus that this country had run in 10 years, primary surplus of 3.5%, and then a primary surplus of 6%, it sounds like a lot of mumbo jumbo to the average person. But believe you me, had we not done the trimming down that we needed to do at that early stage, this country would not have been in a position to go through the last 2 years, especially the decline that would have been foisted on it in 2020, which is now settled at about 14%, with the reduction, or should I say almost the decimation of the arrival of tourists into this country. We then understood that the tentacles of the tourism sector went far and wide, from those who produce agricultural produce and livestock, who no longer had a large market to service. You carried stories of people having to sell pork, if you remember, and to get rid of produce, that they no longer were people capable of buying because the hotels were closed. We understood then the implications for the wholesalers and retailers and the truckers and everyone who all of a sudden had nothing to truck because nobody was buying. This country saw over 32,000 people claim NIS, and we had to pump into the National Insurance Scheme $115 million to be able to sustain that drain on its resources as a result of the COVID crisis. In addition, we had to include new benefits that were not there to be able to deal with self-employed persons, business interruption benefits that were never thought of before. We had to literally turn around and do all of this while, one, reducing the arrears that we inherited from the last government, which was 1.7 billion overall, but of that 1.7 billion, 500 million were state-owned enterprises to central government. We were able to write off most of those, but we had $1.2 billion which the government of Barbados owed to people. And I'm happy to say that 98.5% of that has been cleared. Since then, we found in the last 18 months, as I indicated previously, a small amount of 230 million that was owed under the old VITAS system of the Barbados Revenue Authority, and the government is now working to write that down and to work and offset that against where people owe us money as well. But all in all, the situation with the arrears, our utilization of the bonds to be able to settle outstanding payments. The reality is all of you who are standing in front of me probably have gotten back accustomed to getting your income tax refunds. People who are entitled to reverse tax credits, not only getting what they were getting before, but getting beyond that. We carried the entitlement to reverse tax credit up from 18,000 to 25,000 in 2019 and increased the amount, so you're getting $1,300 a year. We also introduced for the first time a compensatory income credit, which simply means that people who earn between $2,000 a month and just under $3,000, $35,000 a year do not pay a cent in income tax, because whatever you pay, we give you back as a credit at the end of the year. We were also able, as you know, to restructure our corporation taxes, although that remains at a very delicate stage still because of the efforts globally to look at a global minimum corporate tax rate. But it has worked for us by removing the differences between international business and local business, because as you know, that was at the center of a lot of the blacklisting that Barbados was also facing from the European Union. We were able to do all of this, and this is the point that I want to reinforce, while giving people a little breakfast to take a long journey. And that was the language I used with Madame Lagarde when we first started this. And what did that mean? We were able to give the public servants a 5% wage increase at the very start of the program, having had no wage increase for almost a decade. We were able also to increase pensions, non-contributory pensions, by 45%. When we first said we were going to do it, people criticized us and said it could not work. 3.5 years later, we're standing and still ready to prosper. Sorry? Yeah, coming to that, we were able to introduce a minimum wage last year in the middle of a pandemic while being in an IMF program. We were able to buy electric buses, and we now have the largest per capita set of electric vehicles as electric buses, in the region. And the numbers, I think, are about 52. And we were able to refleet the Sanitation Services Authority. We were able to deal with the South Coast Sewage Project and to ensure that sewage was no longer flowing on the roads, and we are now awaiting the completion of the approval for the financing of that project, which will see us elevate the treatment there to tertiary treatment so that that treated water can be utilized for different purposes, agricultural purposes. We were able equally to refleet vehicles and equipment at the Ministry of Public Works, over $10 million in equipment. We were able to build out a new accident and emergency department, which, thank God, we had done it. Can you imagine, with the protocols in the old A&E, what would have happened to us if we had not built out a new accident and emergency department at Queen Elizabeth Hospital? We were also able to develop Harrison's Point, which by all judgments, including the Director General of the WHO and all who have visited it, is world class in its facilities, being able to offer oxygen at 4 times the level that the country and ICU beds would have been able to offer prior to the pandemic. We've done all of this while also boosting the numbers of nurses that the country has to pay on an ongoing basis, while dealing with the beautification and the debushing of the country. And I think by all acclaim, the country is a much, much cleaner place. And we're not only talking about Waterford Bottom to Waterford Boulevard. We've done all of these things while being in an IMF program. The road repairs, from the minute the government came in, we started the road repairs. We have not only completing the IDB road program, we've also entered into another program with the Latin American Development Bank for road repairs, and we have another one with the Chinese government, as you know, for the Scotland District Rehabilitation Program that is now about to start. We also introduced new town and country planning legislation and have a new development board there, and that is working itself out. Obviously, there's still teething problems, but that allows us to be far more transparent as well as enabling with it. We have a new business plan and staffing strategy for the Corporate Affairs Registry, and indeed, you would have seen me at the end of last year launch a software program to be able to allow for electronic access for phase 1 and phase 2, which is a deeper dive, things that lawyers do, will be ready at the middle of this year. We have been able to digitize a number of key departments, from certificates of character to licenses to payment of taxes to e-filing in the Supreme Court Registry. We were able to expand the number of judges dealing both at the criminal level court and also at the high court level. I can go on, and rest assured that I'm not even speaking to a list, I'm speaking from memory. And we've done all of this while being in an IMF program and while being in a pandemic. And I want today to thank the people of Barbados, because we could not have reached this point without the cooperation of the people of this country. It has not been easy. In fact, I laughed at the beginning of this press briefing and said when we first met, I had a lot less gray hair than I do now. But I am thankful for each gray hair, because I believe that it is reflective of the fact that working together, we have been able to achieve what many doubted we could achieve, and what many also, on the other end, hoped we would achieve, but we're nevertheless not sure. We are not out of the woods. The country is a part of a global community that is extremely unstable at this point in time. Indeed, the implications for food, for energy, and for financing costs are all at the center of what the world is concerned about now. And it's largely because, having gone through a pandemic on top of the continued threat of climate crises, and in our own instance, last year we had the trifecta. We had the ashfall from St. Vincent, La Soufrière. We had the freak storm, sorry, guess Colville. We had the freak storm in the middle of June, and then we had Hurricane Elsa, our first hurricane in 66 years. It is likely to be a reflection of what countries in this region will continue to face going forward because of our vulnerability to the climate crisis. When you add to that the disruption to the global supply chain, which started during the course of the pandemic, but has been severely compounded in 2022 by two things. One, the recent shutdown of China, in particular in Shanghai, with the ships just lining up outside. And secondly, with the Russian invasion into the Ukraine, we have serious issues globally with respect to ready access or affordable access to so many key commodities and products that are necessary to keep the supply chain going. It means that the government has had to make modifications to what it spends money on and how it spends money. We have had, since late last year, been meeting with the members of the private sector with respect to the food chain. That is why in the budget that we recently had, we announced that we would not be collecting taxes on the basis of 2022 CIF values, because the reality is that we understand the extent to which freight prices quadrupled and even more in some instances. And hence we use 2019 as our base year for the collection of taxes, because we understand the implications not just to the consumer, but also to the enterprises that are dependent on access to those goods in order to be competitive. We have also recognized that food security, food and nutritional security, and mercifully the government was taking action for a couple of years before that. We were able, one, to have issues, the Ministry of Agriculture start to address the issues of access to water, and you would have seen us put in water ponds at River. We're putting in at Haggots, at Bordens. We have the Lears Land Lease project about to launch fully now with the water pond, 21 million gallons there. Anyone driving past will see the pond there. And we are also about to put in similar facilities in St. Lucie, which, as you know, also suffers from the arid climate. We believe, and this has cost us millions of dollars, we're trying to refine the project by ensuring that we look and see how we can reduce the evaporation and how we can also earn through floating photovoltaic panels with those ponds. We are working with the government of Guyana in a major way to establish a Guyana-Barbados food terminal to also be able to ensure that Barbadians have access to affordable food going forward. While we know that the production in the Ukraine has not necessarily dropped significantly, their problem is accessing ports for international trade, because, as you know, most of the fighting is taking place in the major ports like Odessa. And we have to therefore put ourselves in this region, not just Barbados, in a position that we do not suffer if a boat does not come from Miami every week. And that is really what determines and expresses our vulnerability in the most acute of ways. Next week, I go for 2 days to Guyana. The region, 11 heads of government will be there to meet for the Agricultural Investment Conference, because this is where the rubber hits the road. We've worked out what is necessary to reduce our import bill by 25% regionally in CARICOM, how we need to boost further poultry production, what are the 10 or 12 crops that we need to be producing more of to ensure that we can go further. With this, however, you know what I say all the time, each household needs to become resilient. Each household needs to do some of their own planting and bartering in the neighborhood. Each household needs to go back to the old days where you keep a few chickens, yard fowls, a few sheep, a few things to be able to help yourself. You will never offset all of your needs, but you will at least be able to minimize the extent to which the increased cost in food is affecting your household. And if you are, for example, accustomed spending $300 every 2 weeks on food, and it's now gone to because of inflation, it's gone up by 15-20% to $360, how can you offset that $60 that you now have? What are the goods in that basket of goods that you could grow between you and your neighbors, or you and your family, or you and your church, to be able to offset that increase? We do not live in a world by ourselves. and therefore we have to be conscious of it. The other reality is that the pandemic also slowed us down on some of the structural reforms. We were able to do quite a few, but as you know, there's still a few outstanding. I announced in the budget what we have to do with respect to public sector pensions, but we're going to have a broader discussion nationally on pensions for everyone. And that, quite frankly, is also locked into the fact that the country is underpopulated. And the reports are showing that our population is declining, as well as our labor force has started the trek of declining. And we have all the attributes of a developed country without being a developed country with respect to demographics. So these are the difficult discussions the country will continue to have later this year as to what we do at the end of this program, which comes to an end on the 30th of September. Those are the discussions that we will start once this missions report passes the board in end of June. From July, we'll start discussing, will we have a successor program? If so, what type of successor program? Will we go it on our own? Is it time, is it right to go on your own when interest rates are rising globally? Or do you stay with the comfort of concessional interest rates by having a program and working closely with the other regional development banks and international financial institutions, especially given our vulnerability to climate, and especially given the fact that COVID, even though reduced, is still very much with us. Reduced in terms of severity, even though not numbers. And there's a sense in which the world looks too much like it did 100 years ago, as I keep saying. And therefore, if we look at the geopolitical instability that is there, we have to see how best do we build on what we have from the last 4 years, while at the same time starting to build confidence globally that Barbados is looking different, functioning different, feeling different. I think we are going to still go with a roadshow in September to start to tell our story to the capital markets, because whether we go back into an IMF program or not, we believe that our story, which is a credible story, has to be told in order to be able to start to boost back and get our way back to investment grade, which we had hoped to be much further along had we not had the intervention of the pandemic, as I said, and the climate crises. So I'll stop at this stage, but in summary, the last 3.5 years has been challenging, but we were confident on the 1st of June when we spoke that the combination of the restructured debt combined with the assistance of the International Monetary Fund, not just to be able to access what was effectively the cheapest money in town, but to help us on some of the technical and very complex issues for structural reform, but also to send and to provide an imprimatur, a stamp of approval for the World Bank, for the Inter-American Development Bank, and for the Caribbean Development Bank. In the end, the passage with the World Bank was more torturous than we expected, but we have in fact gotten one policy-based loan from them of $100 million with respect to our fight for COVID. And we are now fighting the battle of trying to tell them that middle-income countries like Barbados and Bahamas really cannot be graduated, and that we still need access to concessional funding, particularly on climate issues. And I've left out the big one, because I know you're going to come at me, but maybe I should just refer to it blanket-wise, and that is water and sewage. This government has spent more money on water and sewage on budget trying to correct a very difficult and awful situation. Sewage we inherited, and you know what we've done there. With respect to water, we entered the 2019 hurricane season with the government being told that many of the tanks that we had would not withstand a Category 3 hurricane or a Category 2 hurricane. We entered it also with no generating capacity at any of our water installations. So when you have an outage island-wide, what happens as well? Water goes too. We entered it with the parishes of St. Joseph and St. John not getting water, and many of you carry the stories on the front page, pictures over and over, to the point now where, thank God, those are now archival material and not fodder for you to carry any pictures for anymore. And we are working still with St. Lucie and St. Peter. As you know, the brown water in St. Lucie has been a problem, and that is a combination of both the rusted pipes, but also in some instances them going into silt in wells like Allendale, which had to be shut down to be cleaned recently here again. The government took a measured approach year by year to water, and for the last 2 years, one of the things that we've had to carry on budget is the equivalent of $30 or $35 million, which is about 1/3 of 1% of GDP, which we would never have had to do before. But because of both the ashfall, after the ashfall, there were 8 parishes that were not getting water in this country out of the 11. Similarly, as I said, we've put to bed the St. John, St. Joseph thing with the Vineyard solution. We've also seen new tanks being built at Castle Grant, and also connections from Ionics to the Shop Hill, which has affected the Bagatelle area. I can go on and on. We bought an additional 20 water trucks, or 20-something water trucks. It's more than 20, I can't remember the exact number, in order to be able to ensure that the distribution of water at the height of those outages was possible. We've now bought, I'm told, trucks now to be able to allow the Water Authority to also reach a wider range of people with increased teams to deal with both strategic mains replacement as well as reacting to burst pipes when they occur. So that these things have been difficult. We've also had, as you know, to put a plan in place for the sargassum seaweed, which cost money and we weren't carrying before as a country. And then we also have had to deal with the reality that some of the wells quite often have to be shut down because of the salinity levels in them, particularly those on the north and west coast. And those have caused difficulties because if you keep pumping them at that level, then the wells will collapse and not be capable of being used. So, as a child, I used to hear the IMF stood for Is Manly Fall, and all of the negatives associated with IMF. No, I'm telling you our reality in the Caribbean. I cannot say otherwise, and we'll have an opportunity to say it next month, I believe, again. But I can't say otherwise that we have had a very mature and rewarding relationship. And I say rewarding because we haven't agreed on everything, but the respect that both sides have had for each other and the understanding of what we are facing, both domestically and internationally, allowed us in every instance to resolve those differences in a way that inured to the benefit of the country in the long term. The reality is that the fund has always been sensitive to our need to be able to carry Barbadians along with us. I don't know of many other IMF programs that have had this level of social support and transformation and protection of the vulnerable, while at the same time addressing the issues of reducing debt and making the country more economically stable and competitive by the structural reforms that we're trying to do. As I said, I would have loved to have been that person that could have reported differently on many things had we not had the pandemic and had we not had the climate crisis. But all in all, in spite of it, we have done well, but we have more to do. And that's the simple message. We have done well, but there is still more to be done because of the interruptions to service in the last 2 years. We are available to any questions. I don't know if Dr. Governor Haynes, all of us are here, separate from obviously Mr. Van Selm.
First, 2 questions to you.
One at a time, please. One blow is kill, go.
Right. Given the challenges that we are now facing with cost of living, government's ambitions for surplus, would that be in any way impacted?
We're going to have to find some ways to ease the pressure off of some people. We've started it already with measures that I announced in the budget. And this government has forever seen people and heard people, and we will continue to see and hear. If that means that there will be implications for additional expenditure or foregone revenue, then obviously that will obviously impact on any intention we have to run the surplus that we want to run. It's early days still, and we are now beginning to see some of the implications, some of the consequences rather, of the cost of living, especially on food. And that's why I'm urging us and urging households, but also Ministry of Agriculture, to be able to expand its food production as much as possible. If you go to Mount Poyer in St. Lucie now, you will see a lot of work being done to be able to ready land, some already planted, others being planted. We're trying to be able to work with existing farmers. I spoke to one up to 2 weekends ago. I saw the most lovely red onions and onions being grown in St. Lucie. And quite frankly, compared to the 12-month-old onions that you buy in the supermarket that we import, I would like to suggest that we do a lot more of that on our own. So all of these things will impact on, yes, the surplus. We need to be able to give the St. Lucie farmers access to water. and the prices that I've seen for that corn are at about $21 million. And we paused it to see if we can do it cheaper and if we can also ensure that there is a way of earning from them in the way that the Williams Group intends to do at the one at the Layers, where they intend to have some photovoltaic panels as well to offset the expenditure, but also to minimize the evaporation of the water if left uncovered to the elements. So short answer, yes, a lot depends on what happens going forward. And you know that the international community is working together on this. I think that the Secretary General has already said that he's mobilized multiple teams to deal with financing, food, and energy, because they anticipate that the crisis could be worse than it was in 2008, 2009, when the last financial crisis was there. Okay?
Second question from me. We are seeing, you would have outlined quite a bit of expenditure that government undertook from COVID until now. We have thought on some exports already, both from your advisory team as well as from unions as well. We are seeing a call now for increase in salaries for public servants. Is that something that is feasible within the context of everything?
I have already committed the government to reviewing allowances, which have not been increased since 2009. I am also, however, going to say to you that we're not going to do anything to literally compromise either the government or the population. And therefore, there has to be a judicious approach. And the last time I checked, the judicious approach does not include making comments in public before negotiations commence. So suffice it to say that whatever we do will be the subject of a respectful set of discussions with the unions, without prejudice to the fact that I've already signaled government's intention to want to see some level of adjustment to allowances that have not been adjusted since 2009. 2009 is what, 13 years ago? So I don't negotiate in public. I think you know that too.
Prime Minister, you mentioned the help that you are giving to the farmers.
Sorry? Take it
You
off.
mentioned the assistance that you are going to give to farmers. I went to a meeting about 2 days ago, and the farmers were claiming that government was not providing any assistance to them. Furthermore, they claim that the increased water rate that government was proposing would essentially break the laws of all the business.
I think that you went to a meeting of a select group of farmers who have a select problem at Spring Hall, who also owe the government funds going back 30 years in some instance and 40 years in some instance. I think that I've also contextualized what they were paying, 66 cents a cubic meter, which is 66 cents for 220 gallons of water, and they've been paying that rate for 40 years, Clyde. I don't know that any other rate that you have been paying for 40 years that has not been adjusted at some point in time. But equally, the government remains willing to meet with them and to listen to them. There may well be a case for us to forgive the debts. That may be true. But we cannot, in today's world, believe that one of the 15 most water-scarce countries can continue to keep water rates at the same level that they were 40 years ago, without reference to the fact that every price has increased upon us, and without reference to the fact that the groundwater crisis that is upon us is also as a result of the climate crisis. We have to drink water as a country. We have to use water as a country. And if we want to do that, we have to make sure that water is first available. And if the cost of making it available is both, one, to increase, augment the supply, and two, deal with the fact that we have something around 45 to 50% of what you call non-revenue water. What is that? Fancy language for the simple fact that for every gallon of water that you pump, or let me put it another way, for every 100 gallons of water that we pump, we're losing 45 to 50 gallons in the pipe in leaks. That's our reality. So I'm more than willing to sit with the farmers, as with, I'm sure the Minister of Agriculture will, and to explain where we are and why we are here. We went through this difficult discussion with bus fares too, remember? Bus fares had not been increased for 30 years, and everybody said it would lead to the collapse of the sector and all of that. Everybody, buses still driving. Nobody likes pain. Look, I get cut here 2 weeks ago. I got the scar to remind me of it. I don't like the pain. I don't want the pain again. But I live, and we will work and ensure that those farmers can live. I told you that especially those farmers, they now will be the beneficiary in St. Lucie of a new water pond, just as we've done in St. Philip, just as we've done at Bordens, just as we've done at Haggards. And we also accept, in fact, only yesterday, Cabinet was discussing the whole issue of how do we create a circular economy with the access to the fertilizers, because we also accept that fertilizer access and costs are being affected by the war in Ukraine. And we have, for example, vinesse that comes from the production of rum that also is capable of being a fertilizer. The smell is not too pretty, but then no chicken manure, no horse manure don't smell pretty either. But it's good for growing vegetables, isn't it? So we have some things that we are putting on the table to be able to ensure that their medium to long-term future is secure. And we're also looking to see how we can remove the concept of a glut from the discussion in agricultural production, because at the end of the day, we should be doing a level of agro-processing which allows us to be able to use all that we produce. I referred just now to the fact that a lot of the onions and some of the other vegetables that we get here are 6 and 9 and 12 months old. And we need to be able to see how we can make sure that we can utilize all that we want with respect to agricultural production. I'll share the final secret with you. One of the reasons we went after the UNCTAD is to be able to influence what are the international rules and policy space that we need. Small island developing states have had to submit to one-size-fits-all rules. The reality is that in Europe, agriculture is subsidized. In the US, agriculture is subsidized. But we were told that we cannot subsidize agriculture as individual small states. And even though we argued for 30 years for special and differential treatment, they wouldn't give it to us. We now know that small states, especially small island developing states, must have a minimum level of food security for when that ship does not come in from Miami or London or wherever it comes from. And you can't ask people to produce only when you have a problem, because they need to be producing year-round in order to produce for when you have a problem. So it means that how do you protect your farmers from the exposure to the international market and cheap imports when they need to have the capacity to grow and supply year-round? And that's the battle that we're fighting at a policy level now. So when you see me making these speeches overseas and making all of this talk, it's not just because we like to talk. It is because that is what is going to make the difference to us being able to protect our domestic agricultural and manufacturing production in a way that we need to now, especially in times of war. And the world is at war. We are at war. We are at war with COVID, we are at war with climate, and we are at war with what is happening with the other consequences of war across the world.